focus in the sessions to date has been on the realities of trade in the various different regions and the trends that are being observed in those regions in relation to Australian agricultural trade. But of course none of that happens without the facilitation and business arrangements and the finance associated with those transactions, and that's quite an important part of making trade happen. So this session we're interested in hearing from participants in that part of the business to get some understanding of how that all works and what trends or what changes are occurring. So we've got three speakers who are going to talk to us about the issues around trade and trade finance. Our first is Karin Kobelentz, who's the Director of Structured Trade and Project Finance at EFIC. And you can see from Karin's brief CV there that she's had considerable experience in both the finance world in Australia and also internationally in some of the leading merchant banks and also in looking at the agriculture sector. So our first speaker for this session is Karin Kobelentz. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Mick, and thank you also to the Australian Farm Institute for giving me the opportunity to speak, and indeed for EFIC, the opportunity for EFIC to sponsor the event. We're very pleased to be here. As Mick mentioned, we've obviously spoken a fair bit about the huge potential for Australian exporters in trade opportunities in various markets. I'm going to talk a little bit about financing some of these exports, and in particular an additional alternative source of finance, which is EFIC. I'll give you a bit of background in terms of who EFIC is, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, what we do. I'll give you some case studies and also talk about the opportunity that we see in the agriculture sector. First of all, to who is EFIC, and Colin George spoke briefly last night about a little bit of background about who we are, so I won't dwell on this too much, but we are Australia's export credit agency. Our role is to support the growth of Australian exports and Australian business, exporting, operating internationally, and indeed supporting those companies that are involved in the export supply chain. We are 100% government owned. We operate, however, on commercial principles, but with a different risk profile to the banks. We are very much a market gap player, and what that means is we provide finance when the private market, the commercial market, commercial finance is unavailable or insufficient. We don't compete with the banks, but we very much complement the commercial banks. Where we see most finance gaps at the moment is around SMEs, but we do also support larger Australian companies and projects, especially those with SME involvement, and those companies in emerging markets that also may be exposed to financing gaps. Some typical attributes of an EFIC client. We do, again, this is very much around SMEs. We define SMEs. Everybody has a slightly different definition of SMEs, but for us it's those Australian companies turning over up to 150 million. We do support those businesses that do have a growing business, looking to grow into international markets, but also have a successful track record of delivery. And we're also very much focused on technical performance risks as well as environmental and social sustainability. Another key aspect for us to be able to provide support is very much around Australian content. That is, we support the export of Australian goods as well as services, and we've heard a little bit about over the last day and a bit about how the importance of Australian services exports as well. The minimum finance requirement that we can support is about 100,000 Australian dollars, so that was recently reduced so that we can support more Australian exporters. Where the gaps are and where commercial lenders often can't provide support is around, or where we find gaps is around companies that may not have tangible security to support commercial finance. So what do we support? We do look at all industry sectors, so that ranges from healthcare to advanced manufacturing to, of course, food and agribusiness. We do support the export of goods and services, but also the export supply chain. And what that means is we can provide support to Australian businesses that aren't directly exporting themselves, but also those, especially smaller companies that may be involved in the supply chain where they are supplying to a larger Australian exporter in the agribusiness sector. That could be, for example, a trading company. ODI is shorthand for Overseas Direct Investment, another area that we support. That, for example, is for Australian companies that are setting up an operation offshore to grow their business internationally. This could be a warehouse or a manufacturing facility. Importantly, it has to have an economic benefit to Australia. And we do support most geographies. Obviously, there's a focus at the moment on China, but I think I agree with others. It's important not to forget some of the other very important trading markets for agricultural goods and services, Middle East, Americas, Europe, etc. So how do we assist? We have various financial solutions to support Australian exporters. Those range from bonds. Australian exporters are often required to provide security under an export contract where the bank or private insurers may not be able to provide that support. This could be advance payment performance or warranty bonds. We do provide working capital finance. That can be in the form of either direct loans for a specific export contract where the bank is unable to provide the finance, or export working capital guarantees where we provide a guarantee to an Australian exporter's bank to facilitate the export. We also provide term debt to fund capital expenditures by Australian companies. The capital expenditure has to be used ultimately to grow Australian exports. And term debt is also used often to fund overseas direct investment. We're also very strong in project finance, that is to finance offshore projects that have significant Australian content, in particular SMEs as well. And that can also be in the agricultural space. And finally, buyer finance, where EFIC finances the buyer of Australian goods and services. The offshore buyers can be in the form of corporate buyers, the buyer's bank, or indeed sovereigns. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. On to a couple of case studies. This is a recent deal that was actually done by my colleague Colin. Cassegrain Wines is an award-winning New South Wales-based winemaker. They are involved more in the processing and distribution of wine, everything from grape crushing to bottling and distribution offshore. They were established in 1984 and began exporting to Japan a few years later. And indeed, Following that, began exporting to Europe, North America, and Asia. They came to the bank and to us more recently to grow their exports into China, taking advantage of the growing middle class in that market and the interest in quality wine. Cassegrain needed more working capital to purchase the grapes, given the long lead times for sales into China. In this case, EFIC provided an export working guarantee facility of $500,000 to enable Cassegrain to invest in capacity so that they could deliver on their contracts to Japan and China. With the help of this facility and their other banking facilities, Cassegrain expect to increase their export sales from 30% to 70% over the next 5 years. So quite a great story. Another case study, slightly different, United World Industries. They're a relatively small Sydney-based grain and cottonseed trader, with China being a key export market. The company's been rapidly growing in recent years and needed additional trading lines from their bank to finance the purchase of grain and seed from the growers. The bank that they were working with, their lending was based on security on property, and the value of that property did not support the additional borrowing that they required to grow their business. EFIC took a slightly different view. We looked at the performance risk of UWE to deliver on their contracts and provided pre-shipment working capital. In this case, we provided a $3 million limit and approval for certain Chinese buyers to support their growth into China. The great news is with this business, after 2 years of EFIC support, they really didn't need us anymore. So the commercial banks were happy to provide finance directly to them without the benefit of an EFIC guarantee. So quite a success story for us. We'd like to see that happen. Another example of a deal, this deal with, we've done a couple of deals together with our friends at Rabobank, actually, to support the dairy industry in Sri Lanka. This is a great example of where Australians' expertise in agriculture is helping an emerging market such as Sri Lanka increase its fresh milk supply. At the moment, Sri Lanka is heavily dependent on milk imports, in particular milk powder imports, and are looking to become self-sufficient in dairy. Here we supported Wellard Rural Exports, one of the world's leading livestock exporters based in WA. In this case, we provided what we call a buyer finance facility, where EFIC is providing an export finance guarantee to Rabobank, who is providing a loan to the government of Sri Lanka, so a sovereign loan in this case. And that loan is underpinned by a contract between Wellard and the National Livestock Development Board in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, as part of its development of its dairy industry, required financing to purchase the Australian dairy cattle, which are much more productive than Sri Lankan cows, and also to finance farm infrastructure. So quite an interesting and very important deal for us. We've provided 2 facilities now in total for $28 million US and supporting the export of 2,500 Australian dairy cattle. So where do we see the opportunity? Listen, it's very similar to where the opportunity lies for all Australian agricultural exporters. We were very keen to support this industry. We've obviously spoken about North Asia. We see a lot of demand coming from China. Southeast Asia, I've mentioned Sri Lanka, other markets that we tend to get a lot of demand for are PNG, Vietnam, but also the Middle East, obviously a very important market, as we heard about this morning. I was fortunate enough to join the India Trade Mission with Senator Colbeck back in January, and 450 other Australian delegates. It was a fantastic opportunity for for Australia to showcase its expertise in the agri sector as well as dairy, as Senator Kobelentz spoke about last night. So certainly opportunities there in the longer term, but also very different sectors, different markets, lots of opportunity. Where EFIC can help is either directly through providing working capital or term loans, again, where the commercial market may not have the appetite, or indirectly through things like project finance and buyer finance, like that Sri Lankan example that I gave you. So it's very much around supporting Australian exporters to grow into these markets when the banks can't provide that support, or working together with the banks. So what's our focus on agribusiness? We work with not only the exporters and buyers and, of course, the banks, but also very keen to see how we can further work with Australian agribusiness industry associations, and it's great to see so many industry associations involved in this forum. We think it's a great opportunity to work with you guys to also better access some of the smaller players involved in that export supply chain. We do expect a significant increase in new agricultural export activity in the coming years. Where we're seeing a lot of activity is around meat exports, wine, nut and livestock, but also getting inquiries now from things like specialized manufacturing. But I'm also keen to explore areas such as horticulture and citrus to cotton and some of the other sectors that have been spoken about. So hopefully that's given you a better understanding of who EFIC are, what we do, and when we can help. Agribusiness is very much a key sector where we are looking to provide additional support. I've given you some examples, but we're keen to do so much more. So please feel free to contact either myself or my colleague Karin, who I'm sure many of you have met already and who of course spoke last night. We do look forward to working with you to support more Australian agriculture exporters. Thank you.